February, I'm waited to 1959, the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States are locked in a death spiral of nuclear brinkmanship, each racing to develop weapons more terrible than the last. Behind the Iron Curtain, in the vast frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains, the Soviet military is testing things the world will not learn about for decades. And on February 2nd, 1959, 9 experienced hikers died on a remote mountain slope in circumstances so bizarre, so inexplicable, that nearly 65 years later we're still trying to understand what happened. And their tent was found slashed open from the inside. Their bodies were scattered across the snow, some nearly naked despite temperatures far below freezing. Some showed signs of massive internal trauma with no external wounds, as if they'd been in a car crash but there were no cars. One was missing her tongue and eyes. They'd fled their tent in terror, running barefoot into a Siberian night that would kill them within hours. The Soviet authorities investigated, then abruptly closed the case, classifying it for decades. The official conclusion? A compelling natural force had killed them, not an avalanche, not hypothermia, not animal attack. An unnamed, unexplained, compelling natural force. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, named for the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. And the question that has haunted researchers, investigators, and conspiracy theorists for more than 6 decades is simple. What force was so compelling that experienced mountaineers would rather die in the snow than stay in their tent? Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most persistent theories about what happened on that mountain, that the Dyatlov group stumbled into a Soviet military testing zone, witnessed something they were never supposed to see, and paid for that mistake with their lives. We'll examine the evidence that supports this theory, the holes in the official story, and the chilling possibility that 9 young people were sacrificed to protect Cold War secrets. But before we dive into conspiracy and cover-up, we need to understand who these people were, because they weren't naive tourists. They were expert outdoorsmen and women, the kind of people who knew how to survive in the worst conditions nature could throw at them, which makes what happened to them all the more terrifying. January 23rd, 1959, Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, a city in the heart of Soviet Russia, east of Moscow, gateway to Siberia. 9 students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute gathered for what should have been the adventure of a lifetime, a Category 3 winter hiking expedition to Otterten Mountain in the northern Urals. Category 3 was the highest difficulty classification in Soviet mountaineering. These weren't casual weekend hikes. This was serious, dangerous terrain that required serious, experienced people, and that's exactly what they were. Igor Dyatlov, 23, was the expedition leader, a 5th-year radio engineering student, experienced hiker, and meticulous planner. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, strong and athletic, one of the best female hikers in the institute. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, economics student, tough as nails. Rustem Slobodin, 23, engineering student and talented guitarist. Yuri Yudin, 21, economics student. Georgy Krivonishenko, 23, recent engineering graduate working at a secret nuclear facility. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, another student from the institute. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, physics student. And Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, engineering student with a French surname but wholly Russian. There was a 10th member originally, Yuri Yudin, who had to turn back on January 28th due to illness. His decision to leave the group probably saved his life, and he would spend the rest of his days trying to understand what killed his friends. These weren't reckless thrill seekers. They'd trained together, hiked together, survived harsh conditions together. They knew the risks of winter mountaineering in the Urals. They knew about hypothermia, frostbite, avalanches, storms. They were prepared. The expedition's goal was to reach Otterten Mountain, plant a banner, and return. The route would take them through areas classified as Mansi territory, the Mansi being the indigenous people of the region, and through some of the most remote, uninhabited wilderness in the Soviet Union. They carried appropriate gear, warm clothing, a tent, food supplies, axes, knives, cameras, and journals to document their journey. For the first week, everything went according to plan. Their route took them by train to Ivdel, then by truck to Vijay, the last inhabited settlement, and then on foot into the wilderness. They left supplies for their return journey at a forest storage hut. They documented their progress with photographs and journal entries. The photos show young people laughing, playing in the snow, enjoying the adventure. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin said goodbye to his friends and turned back, leaving 8 men and 1 woman to continue toward Otorten. The group's plan was to reach Otorten, which lay about 10 kilometers away, and then telegraph their sports club no later than February 12th to confirm their safe return. When that date passed with no word, people began to worry. When more days passed with continued silence, search parties were organized. The last photograph in their cameras was dated February the 1st, showing the group setting up camp on the slope of a mountain they didn't know they were climbing, a mountain that would later be named Kholat Syakhl, which in the Mansi language means dead mountain. On February 2nd, something happened, something so terrifying that 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their tent from the inside, not untying the entrance, not opening it normally, but slashing through the canvas in a panic, and fled into the deadly Siberian night, wearing only underwear and light clothing, no boots, no heavy coats, nothing that would allow them to survive more than a few hours in the temperatures that range from -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. And then they died. One by one, in different locations, in different ways, their bodies telling a story that doesn't make any conventional sense. It would be 3 weeks before anyone found them, and what the searchers discovered would spark a mystery that refuses to die. February 26th, 1959. 3.5 weeks after the Dyatlov group was last seen alive, a search party led by students and volunteers found their abandoned tent on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. The tent was partially collapsed, covered by snow, but that's not what made the searchers' blood run cold. The tent had been cut open from the inside, multiple cuts made deliberately with a knife or blade, not neat cuts from someone calmly exiting, but frantic slashes from people desperate to get out fast. Inside the tent, everything was left behind: boots, heavy coats, all the gear that would keep you alive in Arctic conditions. Food was still there, partially eaten. The stove was cold. Everything suggested the occupants had fled suddenly, in the middle of undressing for sleep or just after, giving up all the equipment that stood between them and death by freezing. But why? What could make experienced mountaineers do something so suicidal? The searchers followed footprints leading down the slope toward the forest edge, about 1.5 kilometers away. There were 8 or 9 sets of tracks, some barefoot, some in socks, some in a single felt boot. The prints suggested people walking, not running in panic, but walking with apparent purpose toward the tree line. At the forest edge, under a large cedar tree, they found the first bodies: Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonashenko, both dead, lying near the remains of a small fire. They were barely clothed, Doroshenko in underwear and a torn shirt, Krivonashenko in just underwear. The fire had been built but had obviously failed to keep them warm. The cedar tree branches above them had been broken off to a height of 5 meters. Someone had climbed the tree, possibly to look back at the tent, or to look for something else. Between the cedar tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies over the following days. Zenaida Kolmogorova, about 330 meters from the cedar, face down in the snow. She'd made it further than the others at the cedar, climbing back toward the tent before succumbing to hypothermia. Rustem Slobodin, another 180 meters closer to the tent. He had a small crack in his skull, not severe enough to be immediately fatal, but indicative of some kind of impact. And Igor Dyatlov himself, the expedition leader, found another 300 meters toward the tent. He was on his back, his hand grasping a small birch branch, as if he'd been trying to pull himself forward when he died. These 5 deaths could be explained by hypothermia. They'd fled the tent for some reason, tried to build a fire, failed to get warm enough, and died of exposure while trying to make it back to shelter. Tragic, puzzling, but not impossible to understand. But the other 4 were missing, and when they were finally found on May 4th, over 2 months after the incident, the mystery became something darker. The remaining 4 bodies, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Zolotaryov, who had joined the group at the last minute, were discovered in a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow. They were better dressed than the others, wearing clothes that had been removed from the bodies at the cedar tree. This suggested they'd survived longer and had taken clothing from their dead companions to stay warm. But here's where it gets truly strange. 3 of these 4 had massive internal injuries. Dubinina had major chest fractures, 8 broken ribs. Thibault-Brignol had a severe skull fracture. Zolotaryov had 5 broken ribs. The medical examiner stated that the force required to cause such injuries was comparable to a high-speed car crash, yet there were no external wounds, no bruising, no soft tissue damage that usually accompanies such trauma. It was as if they'd been subjected to an enormous pressure or blast wave that crushed their internal organs without damaging their skin, and Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, part of her lips, and facial tissue. Kolovatov was missing his eyes as well. The medical examiner suggested this was due to natural decomposition and scavenging animals, but the bodies had been in freezing conditions that should have preserved them. The official investigation documented all of this. They photographed the bodies, the tent, the scene. They interviewed witnesses, friends, and family members. And then, in May 1959, the case was suddenly closed. The conclusion, as written by prosecutor Lev Ivanov, was that the group had died due to a compelling natural force, which they were unable to overcome. The case files were classified and sent to a secret archive. The area around Koletschakal was closed to hikers and expeditions for the next 3 years. No explanation of what that compelling natural force was. No identification of what caused the internal injuries. No theory about why they fled the tent. Just a compelling natural force. And there the mystery might have remained, buried in Soviet archives if not for persistent journalists, researchers, and the families of the victims who refused to let the story die. Over the decades, various theories emerged. Avalanche, infrasound causing panic, animal attack, paradoxical undressing from hypothermia, ball lightning, even more exotic theories involving UFOs or the Yeti. But one theory has remained consistently compelling, supported by circumstantial evidence and the peculiar behavior of Soviet authorities, that the Dyatlov group stumbled into a military testing zone and were killed by something the Soviet government desperately wanted to keep secret. Let's examine that evidence. The northern Urals in 1959 were not empty wilderness. They were, in fact, one of the most militarily sensitive regions in the entire Soviet Union. Just 150 kilometers south of the Dyatlov Pass was Chelyabinsk 40, now known as Ozersk, a closed city that didn't officially exist. It was home to Mayak, one of the Soviet Union's primary nuclear weapons production facilities. This was where plutonium was produced for the Soviet nuclear arsenal. In September 1957, just 16 months before the Dyatlov incident, the Kishtim disaster occurred there, a nuclear waste tank explosion that released massive amounts of radiation, contaminating a huge area. The disaster was completely covered up by Soviet authorities and not revealed to the world until decades later. To the west was the Kapustin Yar missile test range. To the east, more secret military installations. The Urals were a testing ground for some of the most sensitive military technology in the Cold War arsenal. And here's something crucial. Georgy Krivonyshenko, one of the Dyatlov group members, worked at Mayak. He had security clearance. He knew about nuclear facilities and testing protocols. Now let's look at some specific pieces of evidence that point toward military involvement. First, the radiation. When the bodies were examined, some of the clothing showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. Not enough to cause immediate harm, but significantly above background levels. The medical examiner noted this in the autopsy reports. Where did this radiation come from? If it was from Krivonishenko's work at Mayak, why were his clothes more radioactive than we'd expect from normal contamination? Why were other group members' clothes also showing elevated readings? Second, the orange lights. In the weeks around the Dyatlov incident, multiple witnesses in the region, including meteorologists at a nearby weather station and the Mansi people, reported seeing strange orange or bright lights in the night sky over the mountains. These weren't stars or auroras. They were described as glowing spheres or fireballs moving slowly across the sky. One of the other hiking groups in the region on the night of February 2 reported seeing bright flying spheres in the direction of Kholat Shakhl. The weather station staff documented unusual glowing phenomena. Even prosecutor Lev Ivanov, who led the investigation, later stated in 1990 that he was convinced the lights were connected to the deaths and that he'd found burn marks and other evidence that suggested some kind of unknown force. What could cause such lights? In 1959, the Soviet military was testing R-7 missiles, the same rockets that would launch Sputnik and later Yuri Gagarin into space. They were also testing various rocket-based weapon systems. A missile test gone wrong, or the testing of experimental ordnance, could produce exactly the kind of bright lights witnesses described. Third, the injuries. Those massive internal injuries, crushed ribs, fractured skulls, but no external wounds, don't match any natural phenomenon. They don't match an avalanche, which would have left external trauma and bruising. They don't match a fall, which would have damaged the skin and extremities. They don't match animal attack or hypothermia, but they do match one thing, a pressure wave from an explosion, specifically the kind of pressure wave from a thermobaric or fuel-air explosive device. Here's how these weapons work. They disperse a cloud of flammable vapor and then ignite it, creating a massive blast wave that doesn't necessarily produce shrapnel or flame, but generates enormous overpressure. This pressure wave can cause internal injuries, ruptured organs, crushed chest cavities, brain trauma without external wounds. It's the pressure differential that does the damage. The Soviet military was experimenting with thermobaric weapons in the late 1950s. Were they testing them in the Urals? Fourth, the cover-up. The Soviet investigation was thorough at first, but then it abruptly stopped. The case was closed without a satisfactory conclusion. The files were classified. The area was closed to civilians for 3 years, an extraordinary measure that suggests something in that region needed to be protected or hidden. When prosecutor Ivanov was interviewed decades later, he stated that he was ordered by high-ranking officials to close the case and attribute the deaths to natural forces. He wasn't allowed to investigate the military angle. He wasn't permitted to consider the possibility of weapons testing. Why? If the deaths were truly due to an avalanche or some other natural disaster, why classify the files? Why close the investigation so quickly? Why seal off the area? Fifth, the behavior pattern. The way the Dyatlov group fled their tent, cutting through it in panic, abandoning all their survival gear, suggests they were running from something immediate and overwhelming. Not something gradual like cold or weather, something sudden, something they saw or heard that triggered absolute terror. Witnesses who saw the bodies described their facial expressions as showing extreme fear or horror. What could cause experienced hikers to make the suicidal decision to abandon their only shelter and run into deadly cold? One possibility. They saw a missile or rocket heading toward them and had seconds to get away from the impact zone. The tent, as a fabric structure, would offer no protection from an explosion or missile strike. Their only chance was to run. Another possibility. They were caught in the perimeter of a test zone when a weapon was deployed. The bright lights others saw could have been the launch or deployment phase. The Dyatlov group might have witnessed the approach of something they couldn't identify, something bright, loud, and coming right at them. In a state of panic, they fled. The explosion or pressure wave caught some of them in the ravine, causing the massive internal trauma. The others died of exposure while trying to return to the tent. Sixth, the witness intimidation. After the incident, the Mansi people in the region report being questioned intensely by Soviet officials and military personnel. Some were reportedly threatened or warned not to talk about what they'd seen in the mountains. The Mansi had lived in those mountains for generations. They knew the terrain, the weather, the dangers. If the deaths were due to natural causes, why intimidate local indigenous people into silence? Seventh, the subsequent incidents. The Dyatlov Pass incident wasn't the only mysterious death in that region during this period. There were other unexplained disappearances and strange occurrences in the Urals throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. Multiple hiking groups reported unusual phenomena, lights, sounds, feelings of being watched or followed. Some groups turned back from expeditions due to inexplicable fear or unease. This pattern suggests the region was actively being used for something dangerous, something that occasionally resulted in civilian casualties. Now, let's address what this theory would mean if it's true. If the Soviet military was testing weapons in the northern Urals, missiles, rockets, thermobaric explosives, or other experimental ordnance, they would have established testing zones. But these zones weren't always clearly marked or perfectly controlled. In the vast Soviet wilderness, it would have been possible, even easy, for a group of hikers to inadvertently enter a danger area. If the Dyatlov group did this, and if a test was being conducted that night, they might have been caught in the effects of that test. The immediate response would have been to flee. The government's response would have been to cover up the incident, to avoid revealing their testing activities to both their own population and to Western intelligence. 9 young lives sacrificed on the altar of military secrecy and Cold War paranoia. But is this what actually happened? Let's look at the counterarguments. The military testing theory is compelling, but it has significant problems. Let's be honest about them. Problem 1, the radiation levels. While some clothing did show elevated radiation, the levels weren't consistent with exposure to nuclear weapons or a nuclear accident. They were patchy, localized, and not nearly high enough to explain the deaths. If the group had been caught in a nuclear test or radiation leak, we'd expect much higher, more uniform contamination. The radiation evidence points to something, but it's not clear what. Problem 2, the timing of the injuries. If a pressure wave from an explosion killed the 4 in the ravine, why were they better dressed than the others? Why had they taken clothing from the bodies at the cedar tree? This suggests they survived for some time after fleeing the tent, possibly hours. An explosion would have killed or injured them immediately, not allowed them time to scavenge clothing and move to the ravine. Some researchers argue there could have been 2 events: the initial cause that made them flee, and then a secondary explosion or event that caught them later. But that's adding complexity without clear evidence. Problem 3, the lack of physical evidence. If there was a missile test or explosion, where's the crater? Where are the burn marks, the residue, the physical evidence of high explosives or military ordnance? The investigation found none of this at the scene. The tent was damaged by cutting from inside, but showed no damage from external forces like blast waves or impacts. Problem 4, the alternative explanations. In 2019, a new investigation by Russian authorities concluded that an avalanche killed the group. While this explanation has been heavily criticized, there was no avalanche debris, the slope wasn't steep enough, and the hikers were experienced enough to avoid avalanche terrain, it does provide a conventional explanation. Other researchers point to a phenomenon called infrasound, ultra-low-frequency sound waves that can be generated by wind patterns in mountainous terrain. Infrasound can cause panic, disorientation, fear, and even physical symptoms in humans. If the tent was positioned where infrasound resonated, the group might have been driven to panic without understanding why, fleeing from an invisible threat that felt overwhelming. There's also the possibility of paradoxical undressing, a known late-stage symptom of hypothermia, where victims feel hot and remove clothing. Combined with poor judgment from oxygen deprivation, hypothermia can explain some of the strange behaviors. Problem 5. The military's operational patterns. Soviet military testing zones were typically heavily controlled and monitored. It's unlikely they would have conducted dangerous tests in an area where civilian hikers might be present without first securing the zone. And if they did accidentally kill civilians, the more typical Soviet response would have been to make the bodies disappear entirely, not to conduct a semi-public investigation that drew attention. Problem 6. The missing motive for cover-up. If the deaths were accidental casualties of military testing, why allow an investigation at all? Why not just declare the hikers missing, say they were lost in a blizzard, and move on? Instead, authorities conducted autopsies, documented the scene, and created files that, while eventually classified, still existed and eventually became public. A true cover-up would have been simpler, cleaner, more absolute. These are real problems with the military theory. They don't disprove it, but they complicate it. They force us to either add layers of speculation or admit that the evidence is ambiguous. And yet, the official explanation is also deeply unsatisfying. A compelling natural force isn't an explanation. It's an admission that they didn't know or couldn't say what happened. So where does that leave us? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle ground. Perhaps there was military activity in the region, not necessarily a direct weapons test, but missile flights, rocket tests, or other operations that produced unusual lights and sounds. Perhaps the Dyatlov group saw something they shouldn't have, not close enough to kill them directly, but close enough to panic them. Perhaps they fled in fear, made poor decisions in the dark, and died of exposure and injuries from falls or accidents during their flight. And perhaps the Soviet authorities, recognizing that military activity had indirectly caused civilian deaths, chose to close the case and classify it, rather than admit their operations were putting civilians at risk. This wouldn't require a massive conspiracy, just normal bureaucratic cover-your-ass behavior by military and government officials who didn't want to be blamed for the deaths of 9 popular students. But there's one more angle we need to consider, the angle that prosecutor Lev Ivanov himself pointed to decades later, and that numerous witnesses corroborated: those lights in the sky. In 1990, 30 years after the incident, former prosecutor Lev Ivanov gave an interview to a Kazakh newspaper. He was old by then, retired, with nothing left to lose by telling the truth, and what he said was startling. I suspected at the time, and am almost sure now, that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to the group's death. He went on to describe how he'd found evidence at the scene: burn marks, unusual patterns in the snow, things he wasn't permitted to include in his official report. He stated that high-ranking officials had ordered him to stop investigating the military angle and to close the case with a vague conclusion. "The thing is," Ivanov said, "we were told at the time that these phenomena were not related to anything on the ground, but we knew that wasn't true. We knew something was being tested." What were those lights? We know for certain that in 1959, the Soviet Union was actively developing and testing rocket and missile systems. The R-7 Semyorka missile, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, had been successfully tested in 1957. The Soviet space program was gearing up for Yuri Gagarin's historic flight in 1961. This required extensive testing of rocket motors, guidance systems, and safety protocols. Rocket launches produce exactly the kind of bright lights witnesses described: a glowing tail, a bright sphere at the front, moving slowly across the sky before accelerating or changing direction. From a distance, especially at night, a rocket test would appear otherworldly, strange, potentially terrifying to people who didn't know what they were seeing. Now, Here's a documented fact. The Baikonur Cosmodrome, the primary Soviet space and missile launch facility, is located in Kazakhstan, south of the Urals. But the Soviet Union had multiple smaller test facilities and launch sites throughout its territory. The northern Urals, remote and uninhabited, would have been an ideal location for testing flight paths, testing guidance systems over mountainous terrain, or testing rockets away from the main launch facility. Could the Dyatlov group have witnessed a rocket test? Imagine this scenario. It's night on February 1st. The group is in their tent preparing for sleep. Suddenly, they see through the fabric or hear a roaring sound outside. They look out and see a bright light approaching from the distance, a rocket or missile on a test flight, burning bright as it crosses the sky. For city dwellers familiar with such things, this might be identifiable. But for hikers in the remote wilderness, expecting to see only natural phenomena, it would be shocking, possibly terrifying. If the rocket appeared to be coming toward them, if it looked like it might impact nearby, the natural response would be panic. They cut through the tent faster than untying the entrance and run. They flee downhill toward the tree line, seeking cover. The rocket passes overhead or impacts somewhere else. But now they're scattered, poorly dressed, in deadly cold. This explains the panic. It explains the lights. It explains why they fled without proper clothing. They thought they had seconds to live and acted accordingly. But it doesn't fully explain the injuries, unless there's more to the story. Here's where we enter more speculative territory, but territory supported by declassified information about Soviet weapons programs. In the late 1950s, the Soviet military was experimenting with multiple weapon systems beyond just rockets. They were developing thermobaric explosives, as mentioned earlier. They were testing high-altitude parachute mines, weapons that would be dropped from aircraft or rockets and descend slowly on parachutes before detonating. They were exploring various methods of area denial and anti-aircraft defense. Some of these systems used fuel-air mixtures that, when ignited, would create massive blast waves over wide areas. Others used sustained burning fuel that would create illuminated clouds or spheres of fire. Many would have produced the bright flying spheres that witnesses described. What if the Dyatlov group encountered a test of such a weapon? They see lights approaching. They flee the tent thinking a weapon is about to strike. Most of them make it to the tree line, but then the weapon detonates or activates, not directly on them, but close enough. The four in the ravine, perhaps more exposed or in the direct path of the pressure wave, suffer massive internal trauma. The others, further away or behind cover, survive the blast but are now trapped in deadly cold. This scenario fits the evidence better than any single explanation. It explains the panic in cutting through the tent. It explains the lights witnesses saw. It explains the internal injuries from pressure waves. It explains why some died from exposure and others from trauma. It explains the Soviet cover-up, accidental casualties from weapons testing. It explains the radiation if the weapon included any radioactive components or tracers. It explains the closure of the area for 3 years while testing continued. But here's what we need to acknowledge. This is speculative reconstruction based on fragmentary evidence. We don't have smoking gun proof of a weapons test on February 1st, 1959. We don't have military documents admitting to operations in that area that night. What we have is a pattern of circumstantial evidence. The lights, the injuries, the military presence in the region, the witness intimidation, the abrupt case closure, the prosecutor's later statements, and the simple fact that the official explanation, compelling natural force, explains nothing at all. The truth, as is often the case with Cold War mysteries, may be locked away in archives we'll never access, or may have been destroyed decades ago. But there's one final piece of this puzzle we need to address: what happened afterward, and why the Dyatlov Pass incident still matters today. In the decades since 1959, the Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most analyzed mysteries. Over 75 theories have been proposed. Hundreds of articles, dozens of books, multiple documentaries, and even feature films have explored what happened on that mountain. In 2019, Russia reopened the investigation, eventually concluding it was an avalanche. The families of the victims rejected this conclusion, pointing out the same inconsistencies that researchers have noted for decades. The case was closed again, with many questions still unanswered. But here's what's truly significant. Starting in 2013, the Russian government began declassifying documents related to Soviet-era military testing in the Urals. And what those documents revealed was stunning. The northern Urals were far more militarized than anyone outside the Soviet military command structure had realized. Multiple missile test ranges, radar installations, secret listening posts, underground facilities. The Urals were a major hub of Cold War military activity, and much of it was conducted with minimal concern for civilian safety or even civilian awareness. We now know that the Mayak nuclear facility, where Dyatlov, group member Krivonishenko, worked, had multiple accidents beyond the famous Kishtim disaster. Accidents that were covered up, that released radiation, that contaminated areas and people. We know that weapon testing throughout the region sometimes went wrong, causing unintended casualties that were quietly buried in classified reports. The pattern of secrecy, cover-up, and prioritizing military operations over civilian safety is well documented now. It was standard operating procedure. So when we ask whether the Soviet military could have accidentally killed 9 hikers and then covered it up, the answer isn't speculation. It's historical pattern. We know they did this kind of thing. We know they had the capability, the motive, and the institutional culture that would make such a cover-up not just possible, but probable if the circumstances required it. Does this prove the military killed the Dyatlov group? No, but it establishes that such a scenario is entirely plausible within the context of Soviet Cold War operations. And here's what makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so enduringly fascinating. It sits at the intersection of verified historical fact and persistent mystery. We know people died. We know how their bodies were found. We know the official investigation was inadequate, and possibly deliberately so. We know the region was militarily sensitive. We know witnesses saw strange lights. What we don't know, what we may never know, is the precise sequence of events that night, the exact cause of death, the exact reason for the panic, the exact nature of what they saw or experienced. And in that gap between what we know and what we can prove, the human mind builds narratives. Some reach for the exotic, aliens, yetis, interdimensional portals. Others, like the military theory we've explored tonight, try to construct explanations based on known Soviet capabilities and documented patterns of behavior. The truth probably lies somewhere in that second category. Not paranormal, but political. Not supernatural, but covered up. Not aliens, but accidents swept under the rug of state secrecy. 9 people died on a mountain. They died in terror, in confusion, in cold darkness. Some died quickly from massive trauma. Others died slowly from exposure, knowing they were doomed, but still trying to survive, trying to get back to their tent, trying to build a fire, trying to hold on. Their families mourned. Their friends demanded answers, and the state that sent them to that mountain, the state that claimed to protect them as Soviet citizens, gave them nothing but a vague phrase and a sealed file. A compelling natural force. Perhaps that force was a pressure wave from a weapon test. Perhaps it was a rocket that went off course. Perhaps it was something more mundane that we've simply failed to reconstruct correctly from fragmentary evidence. But whatever it was compelling enough to drive 9 intelligent, experienced people to their deaths. And the fact that we're still asking questions 65 years later tells you everything you need to know about the adequacy of the official explanation. The Dyatlov Pass incident stands as a reminder of what happens when military secrecy collides with civilian life. when the machinery of state power values its secrets more than its citizens' lives, when the expedient cover-up is chosen over the uncomfortable truth. It's not unique in this regard. Cold War history is littered with similar incidents on both sides of the Iron Curtain, but it's perhaps the most famous, the most analyzed, the most stubbornly resistant to neat explanation. Today, you can visit Dyatlov Pass. There's a memorial to the 9 hikers. The area is no longer closed. You can H